All right. Good afternoon, or whenever you're watching this. I'm recording in the afternoon. Yeah, this will be the next in our series of review sessions. It's a weird day. It's on a Friday, which is not the normal day for it, but I got my second dose of the COVID vaccine yesterday, and that's gone well. No side effects today, which is awesome. But in today's live stream video, I'm going to be going through the majority of Unit 2 in AP Macroeconomics. That'll be GDP, how it's calculated, both the expenditures and the income approach, what it's used for, what's not in it, etc. Inflation, as it pertains mostly to CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as well as unemployment. We're going to hit on those three topics. I'm going to try and get through them in 30 minutes so that we have time to do the questions I've got pulled up on AP Classroom. 30 minutes is a super low estimate for how fast I can get through a nice clean summary of all of these. So yeah, that will be a really, really adventurous idea by me to see if I can pull off a full review of almost all of Unit 2 in 30 minutes. But we'll see how it goes. I don't expect to see a ton of viewers for this one because it's not my normal date or time. So I'm going to get started at 4:30, which it's 4:27 on my clock right now. So if you want to skip ahead a few minutes, if you're watching this later, feel free. But I'm just going to check a couple of things real quick before we get started. Let's see. That looks good. This is a nice little abbreviation of what we're going to be covering today, like in bullet point form, all the things I'm going to try to hit in that 30 minutes review session. I'm going to try to type out every formula you might need as I go through and think of them. I can't imagine I'll be able to remember every formula off the top of my head. So if your teachers have given you a formula sheet, or if you're in one of my classes, there's a formula sheet on my course page on our Moodle. So feel free to use that as well. But be aware that on the AP macro exam, they will not give you a formula sheet, so you do have to memorize a bunch. It's one of those things where, yeah, it's annoying, but there's not a terrifying number of them. It's probably caps out around 16 formulas total. But most of them are in this unit, so you're going to see a bunch of them in today's video and be thrown off that, like, there's so many formulas. It's like, most of it's in Unit 2. So that if you memorize all of these, you should be covered for the majority, outside of just getting the couple of ones for the multiplier and the quantity theory of money. Those are the only other formulas you might need. Well, yeah, we'll get started here in about a minute or two. Trying to think of anything that's important to mention to any of you guys that are watching this later. Keep an eye on the channel. Again, this is not a normal date for me to record this. These will almost always be on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's the game plan. But if something happens, I'll shoot an email to my students and you'll get a notification on the channel of me not going live or whatever. About one more minute before I get started. I am again not sitting in the squeaky chair. I have remembered to do that this time. Oh man, all the math. I'm trying to think of all the math off the top of my head. Okay, I got 4:30 on my clock. Let's see if I can nail through this review in 30 minutes, because that's a lot to expect, but let's see if I can pull it off. All right. First things first, biggest topic in Unit 2 is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. GDP is the dollar value of everything produced within our country's borders in a given year. Good afternoon, Judson. Good to see you in the chat. And it will cover basically a few things for us. This is probably the most important thing to know about GDP is what sort of words substitute for it / what it really tracks. GDP measures the dollar value of everything produced in our country. But what that means really is that it tracks a few things. Output, which is the number of things being produced. You can usually track that with GDP. Productivity, because if you have a higher GDP than a previous year, you're probably more productive. We'll get into why you might not be. Income, because every dollar spent is a dollar earned, so if we're more productive, incomes should be rising. And spending. So I've got output, productivity, income, spending. Looking at GDP year to year, it going up means most of the time that all of those things are also going up. The only times where that might not be the case is if there's a bunch of inflation happening. So we're going to go through inflation as well here in a bit. So again, GDP measures all the dollar values of everything being produced. There are a couple of big ways to figure out GDP, like mathematically. You could do prices times quantities if they give you small amounts of goods. Say it's a country that makes 5 markers, sells them for $2 a pop, then its GDP would just be $10. So you literally just take the dollar value of everything produced, so you just do price times quantity. But the two main methods you see are the expenditures and the income approach. Now, you can use the expenditures approach probably 9 times out of 10. The expenditures approach is just to add up all of the major spending categories for an economy, and there are 4 of those. Consumer spending, actually I'll start typing this one down to the formula thing. Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. That's the expenditures approach to GDP formula. You add up those 4 things, that will give you your total nominal GDP. The income approach, which would also work, is you take wages, rent, interest, and profit, which is weird. You won't see that as an option a whole lot. There aren't a lot of questions that allow you to even do the income approach, but the basic concept is if you added up all the spending, it should equal adding up all of the income. And these 4 things are just different ways of categorizing the spending, and these 4 things are just different ways of categorizing the income. If you add up all the spending, add up all the income, it should be the exact same, because again, every dollar spent is a dollar earned. Money that's flowing in your economy properly should be a 1-to-1 ratio of income versus spending. You can't spend money if you don't have it, right? Basic idea. Now, what is and is not in GDP is also an important thing to keep an eye on. GDP measures stuff made here, so a good made in an American factory overseas counts for that country's GDP, not the United States's. Additionally, some other things to worry about would be like used goods do not count as part of GDP because they were counted in a previous year. You would say non-production transactions, when something isn't really being produced, like a stock being sold or a bond being sold, those don't count for GDP either because nothing is actually being made there. Additionally, GDP doesn't include things that are what are listed as off-market transactions, things that are not recorded in any sort of ledger, things that are not being taxed at all. So like a lemonade stand is an innocent example of this, or someone who's like a babysitting probably doesn't pay taxes on that income, so that's off the books, wouldn't count for GDP. Additionally, it includes like illegal stuff like the drug trade, things like that. Those, if it's not being counted legal because it's not legal, then it wouldn't be counted as part of GDP. So those are some things that do and don't count for GDP. Now, the part that tends to mess people up the most from a vocab standpoint is the idea of real and nominal GDP. Now, whenever you see the words nominal in front of any metric, that just means that number as it stands in its current form. So I say nominal GDP of 2020, that just means I took the GDP of 2020 using 2020 stuff, 2020's prices, kept everything standard to that year, didn't do anything crazy. Okay, nominal is normal GDP. It's regular, plain old GDP. Real GDP takes that nominal GDP and corrects it. What it does is that it puts all the prices that you're tracking in a base year's prices. So like, say I'm trying to compare 2020's production to 2016's production. It's not fair to compare the nominal GDPs of those 2 years because prices go up on average 2 to 3% a year. So yeah, 2020's GDP should be a lot higher than 2016's since prices went up. Because if I'm tracking GDP by doing the price and the quantity, prices going up is just as important as quantity going up. But that doesn't mean we're more productive, right? Having higher prices is actually not terribly good. So real GDP would hold those prices constant. I would use 2016's prices for both 2016 and 2020's production. I would use 2020's quantity and 2016's prices. In class, I refer to this as a base year price times a current year quantity to find the real GDP. But the technical formula that you might see for this, for real GDP, the one you'll see most often, is you'll see the nominal GDP divided by what's called the GDP deflator, and multiplied by 100. The GDP deflator is an inflation index. It's like CPI, which we'll talk about here in a second. The idea is we grab as many goods as we can that would count towards GDP, track their price changes over the course of a year, do a weighted average of it, because we don't want every single good to be worth the same when it comes to inflation, because inflation of like a home is more important than the inflation of an expo marker. Like, it's weighted, it's not the same the whole way down. And after doing some fun computations, the GDP deflator gets spat out. What you'll normally see the GDP deflator as is a number that is fairly similar to 100. The formula for it is actually just using algebra, the formula that we've just seen. Nominal over real times 100. So those two formulas right there, even though they are two separate formulas, are technically the same formula. It's just moved around numbers a little bit. Nothing too crazy happening there. But the basic idea is something like this. Say our GDP deflator is 105. If our GDP deflator is 105, that means since the base year, which for indexes, in case you don't know, 100 is treated as like your starting point. So since the base year would have been 100 and it's now 105, that means the prices have gone up by 5%. Technically, I'm doing percent change because that's one of the ways you can find inflation rate. Is that you can do the GDP deflator of year later minus year earlier. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to remember these all off the top of my head, which is a lot. Divided by GDP deflator of year one. You can't see it anymore because my head's in the way. I'll shrink that in a second. Let me add some extra symbols to make this a little easier to understand what's happening, and shrink myself. There we go. That is one of the two ways to find inflation rate here. So I just take the rate of change between GDP deflators. That if we had a GDP deflator of 105 relative to 100, like that's the increase, then it's just a 5% increase in overall inflation. An important thing to know with GDP deflator is that it checks inflation for things tracked by GDP. So that includes a lot of stuff in our economy, covers a whole bunch of bases, but also includes spending like by businesses, the government, and foreigners on our goods. So it might not be the best measure for how much inflation me and you as regular everyday citizens of the United States would be experiencing, right? Because it's not covering just consumer spending, it's covering a lot more than that. So say there's a bunch of inflation that like businesses are experiencing, but consumers aren't. The GDP deflator might say deceive you, but might make you think there's a lot more inflation happening for you than there actually is. Okay. I think there's anything else with GDP that I want to make sure that I hit on before I move past it. No, 10 minutes is a pretty good time to get through all the GDP stuff. Okay, inflation! Inflation is an overall increase in price level. What it means is that the average price of everything in your economy is going up. It's a natural thing that happens over time because as we have more and more people who are buying goods, the price of those goods should continue to rise as long as those goods remain scarce, which pretty much everything is scarce, so that holds true most of the time. There are a couple of different types of inflation, though, that you do want to be aware of. The two big ones are cost push and demand pull. Now, these are both inflation still. They are both prices going up. The difference is why prices are going up. So for cost push and demand pull, the difference is why it's happening. So for cost push, it's inflation caused by rising input costs, meaning because it's more expensive for businesses to produce things right now, they're going to pass that increased cost of production onto the consumers. They're going to raise the price of their goods because it costs them more to produce a thing. From a graph standpoint, cost push inflation is caused by a decrease in supply or aggregate supply on our aggregate supply and demand curve in Unit 3. Now, the problem with cost push inflation is that it can also be stagflation if it happens severely enough and if it triggers a recession. If you have it triggering a recession, then that would actually be stagflation, which is a combination of inflation plus a recession. You get higher prices and higher unemployment. Both are bad things. Demand pull inflation is what we like to consider like your normal slash, let's say good, because it's not always good, but normal inflation. It's inflation caused by rising demand for things. More consumers, more desire for stuff, or more income could all cause us to demand more goods, start buying more goods. Stimulus checks could theoretically cause some demand pull inflation. If it was going to cause any, it would cause that one, because people are now able to demand more goods. I, for example, bought a new TV with my stimulus check because I haven't bought a TV in 9 years, so I got a pretty good one for pretty cheap. That's to say, when things like that happen, it can cause some inflation, right? Getting more people to spend money causes prices to go up. And demand pull is that example of like your normal inflation, the one you see most often. Additionally, this is a small chance this ever comes up, but there is hyperinflation as well as like this third type of inflation. Basically, it's just very, very, very fast inflation over a very, very, very short window of time. Almost always caused by some massive economic disaster. It could be by your country printing way too much of its currency. That's a possible way for it to happen. But it's usually just the sign of like a massive economic collapse. So like Zimbabwe's gone through it. The obvious example is the Weimar Republic in Germany back post World War I. That stuff sucks. You don't want to see it. It's not great. Now, in terms of like high level AP kind of thing, that's kind of hard to understand, is that there are some people who do benefit from inflation. Inflation is a thing that you can actually benefit from. It depends on the situation, but it comes down to basically these three different groups in terms of do they benefit or get hurt by inflation. When we're talking about inflation, what you've got to be aware of is that prices are going up over time, but anything that had been bought previously was bought, so kind of locked into play. Where this comes into like important issues is when we have to deal with things like loans or savings, things that occur over time, accrue interest over time, and inflation's going to mess with it. So for example, say you borrow $20,000 to buy a car right now at 7% interest, right? Say that's what's happening, and you're paying a fixed rate, meaning that the interest rate's going to stay the same no matter what for the duration of the loan. You're paying the same amount every month for the duration of the loan, right? For however long the loan is. For cars, it's usually like 6 years, whatever. You're paying the same amount every single month this whole time. If there's inflation happening, you're paying the same amount each month, whereas everything else in the economy is steadily getting more and more expensive. Again, you're paying the same, everything else is getting more expensive, including cars. Like other cars are getting more expensive, but your car, your payment, that ain't changing. So as a borrower, you actually are technically benefiting from the inflation. You're paying less in interest than you would have originally thought. If there was like 4% inflation and 7% interest rate, you would actually only be paying a real interest rate of 3%. Because that 4% inflation is going to be kind of like eating into the interest through the fact that like values are changing. Again, you're paying that 7%, but it's not going to feel like 7%. It's actually only going to feel like 3% in that example. So you're still paying more than you borrowed, but not as bad of a difference as you thought. So borrowers benefit. In that situation, lenders would be getting hurt. Additionally, if you put your money in a savings account, that interest would also be getting eaten into by the inflation. So you as a saver would be getting hurt as well. So savers and lenders get hurt, borrowers benefit. All right, so how do we track inflation? Mention that there's inflation rate, and there's a technically second formula here where you can use CPI instead. I'm not going to write it again. Can't spell. Or use CPI instead of GDP Deflator. Because the other price index you should know about is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which instead of using every single good that would be counted in GDP, which would be a lot and is a lot, so the CPI is, the GDP Deflator is almost like a strong guesstimate or figured out in hindsight. The CPI uses what's called a market basket. It uses about like 8,000 different goods, specific goods. They track year to year, different categories covering different parts of the economy, trying to like hit one or two things from every single sector to track them and see specifically how much inflation consumers are dealing with. How much are the everyday people of the economy, us, me and you watching this video, us, how much we're dealing with. That's what CPI is tracking. And again, it does this with what's called a market basket, which is just this conglomeration of a bunch of different goods. And they track those prices year to year and do the weighted average thing again. There is a technical formula here, which is you take the price, I'm just going to write it out, of a market basket in the current year over the price of a market basket, of the market basket. There we go. Oh, backset, can't spell. In the base year, times 100. So I just take these two things. If they tell me that the market basket right now is 110 and the market basket in the base year is 100, it would end up being a CPI of 110. For CPI, it's important to mention this works the exact same way logically as the GDP deflator does. So for example, if I'm looking at the CPI of my base year, say I'm trying to find the CPI of 2019 with 2019 as the year it's like setting it as its comparison point, then I'd be putting whatever this is and whatever that is would be the exact same number. Because I'd be looking at the price of a market basket in 2019 over the price of a market basket still in 2019, timesing it by 100, I would always get 100. So an important thing to know with CPI and with GDP deflator is in the base year, both of those price indexes, 100. Again, that's for comparison's sake. It's to make comparing really easily. That way, if you see like, hey, sorry, I'm drinking a lot because I'm talking a lot. So say, hey, CPI is 114 in 2021 with 2017 as the base year. Well then, to find inflation rate, I would be doing the CPI of year 2 minus CPI of year 1 over CPI of year 1 times 100. So in that scenario, I'd be plugging in 114, 100, because again, base year CPI always 100, over 100 times 100. So this last chunk just straight up cancels out. So I'd find that my inflation rate is only 14%. Again, the point of CPI and GDP deflator is to make it very easy for you to figure out inflation rate. Because otherwise you'd be trying to take the price of every single thing and then figure out how much inflation is happening between each good and then averaging it out. That would take a long time. So if they just give you these two numbers, you can easily figure it out. All right, last thing with inflation, dis and deflation. So this should say disinflation. I don't know if I'll be able to edit this. I can, yeah, I did, I made it. All right, great. Disin, whoop, that hitting the wrong letters on the keyboard. There you go. Disinflation and deflation. So these are variations. Sorry, this chair's got like a little pad on it. So disinflation is when there is a decrease in inflation rate. Prices are still going up, but they're going up by less. Think of it as a car that is slowing down, but still going forwards. That's disinflation. Deflation is an overall decrease in price level, meaning everything's getting cheaper. Now, rare for you to see this, not a thing you'll see in the real world in America, like kind of ever. We do get disinflation, it does happen, but deflation isn't really a thing for us because for a large amount of people in our country will have quite a bit of spendable money a lot of the time. So if prices started to drop, they would immediately buy up a bunch of stuff, which would cause the prices to rise because it would cause demand to pull inflation. So deflation is not a thing that we have to worry about too much. Although, if you have a big enough recession that makes it so that very, very few people can actually spend, prices falling could continue to fall for a very long time, which would cause businesses to lose out on a bunch of profit. They'd have to lay off a bunch of workers and make things really bad. So deflation, even though it sounds like nice, it's not great. It's not great. All right, how are we doing? Cool, it's been 20 minutes. I'm nailing this whole do it in 30 minutes thing. Did not expect to be able to pull that off. Okay, unemployment. So, big thing with unemployment is knowing what the heck unemployment actually means, because we have this wrong in our everyday society in terms of how we think about it. Unemployment refers to people who are actively trying to work and are unsuccessful in doing so. It is not people who don't have a job, because there are a bunch of people who don't have jobs who aren't trying to have a job. You can look at like the elderly or children, but also people like in my age group who are like 27 and living at home and are not feeling particularly good about themselves and aren't looking for a job. Those people are not counted as unemployed, like officially. Like you might think like, well, they don't have a job. It's like, correct, but unemployed, they are not, because they're not trying to look for a job. This gets down to what is one of the biggest things for students to make sure that they're being very, very careful about in this part of the class, which is, are they a part of the labor force or not? Are they actually attempting to work or not? If they are attempting to work, cool. Then they are either employed or unemployed if they have a job or not. But unemployment rate is not the percentage of the population that doesn't have a job. It's the percentage of the labor force. It's not the percentage of, the entire population, because that would include a bunch of people that, frankly, should not be counted as unemployed. Mention babies and kids, but also like people who are medically sick or unable to work. Like people like paraplegics, certain jobs they can't do. I'm not going to hold it against them that they can't do those jobs. That's not on them. It sucks. It just happens. And in that case, that person doesn't count as unemployed from the government standpoint. So when you see things like unemployment rate is like 6%, don't go around thinking, all right, 350 million people in America, 6% of them don't have a job. No. It is out of everybody who is attempting to work. And there are some weird caveats here where if you're in the military, you don't factor into the labor force because you are not a civilian anymore. You are not counted as a part of the labor force. Once you retire, you are out of the labor force. Even if you come out of retirement to start working, once you have officially filed for retirement and receive those benefits, you are out of the labor force. So there's a bunch of people that theoretically probably should, or at least like in your brain, should be counted as employed, but aren't because they're not in the labor force at all. And that gets us to the other formula for this. I think this is the last one I really have to actually type for this. Labor force participation rate, which is number of employed and unemployed people divided by the working age population. Times 100. So what that number tells us, what labor force participation rate tells us, is out of everyone who can theoretically be working, how many are trying to. Not how many are working, how many are attempting to work. Some are attempting and are being successful at that attempt. They have a job. Some are attempting and are currently not successful, but they are trying, so they are unemployed. So when you see things like, cool, our labor force participation rate in America is about 50%, 50 to 60%, depending on how well things are going. What that means is that half of the US population is actually trying to work. Again, there are groups of that shouldn't count, like children and babies. But when I'm saying it's working age population, what that means is that those babies aren't included in this. This is everybody who should be working. That makes it very different, because if it's 50%, that means there's a freaking ton of people who could work theoretically and aren't. A large group of that would be discouraged workers, people who have given up looking for a job. They do not count as unemployed because they are not attempting to look for a job, so that's a whole other thing. And they're a huge group. I mean, estimates have that number between 20 and 30 million people. Just freaking crazy. All right. Types of unemployment. At least 3 that you need to know. Structural, frictional, and cyclical. Structural unemployment means that you no longer fit into the structure of the economy. You are unemployed at the moment because your skills are not particularly useful. Whether that be machines have replaced you at your particular job, or your job / business is not a thing that people really care about or want. I always use VHS repairman. That's a bummer. Your job does not really exist anymore. No one really wants you. So if you lose your job because of that, you are structurally unemployed. Second type, frictional. Frictional unemployment is what we consider to be good unemployment. To be clear, it's not good to be unemployed. When I say good, I mean this is unemployment where the reasoning is actually a positive reason, where frictional unemployment happens when you are moving from place to place or career to career or stage of life to stage of life and are unemployed for a period of time as a result. So when you go from college to the workforce, there's a good chance you're going to be frictionally unemployed for a window of time while you're looking for that job, right? You're trying to work, so you're unemployed. You don't have a job, so you're unemployed. But you're attempting to, and it's not because you lost your job, not because you got laid off, but because you just switched from college to career. Cool, that's fine. If you move from place to place, say I stop liking living in Texas and I want to move out to some other state, I'm just going to roll the dice. Let's say Arizona. I don't make it up. Say I want to move to Arizona for some reason. I don't think Texas is hot enough in the summer, so I want to go to the one place that's hotter. I would probably be frictionally unemployed for a period of time because I'm trying to move to a new place and start a new career. Things like that. That's frictional. The last one is cyclical unemployment. This is the bad one. This is the unemployment caused by a recession. If a test question says there is cyclical unemployment at all, that economy is in a recession. Guarantee it, lock it in. It is unemployment caused by recessions and depressions. A lot of people this past year during the pandemic have become cyclically unemployed. It's spelled CYC, like cycle. So it's cyclically unemployed. It is unemployment due to changes in the business cycle, which really means recessions and depressions. All right, last thing with unemployment that matters. The natural rate of unemployment. This comes up a lot, especially in Unit 3 and 4. But the natural rate of unemployment is our ideal level of unemployment. It's if our economy is at full employment, that doesn't actually mean we're at 0% unemployment. As I just mentioned, like, frictional unemployment is straight up good, and structural unemployment even should happen a lot of the time. We should have businesses that stop being popular over time because tastes change. And we should have some people lose their jobs because machines replace them, because that is like a better way of producing the thing. So, I mean, bummer, but it does matter that you can produce things at a lower cost with a machine. It just does matter. It's a bummer, but it does matter. So the natural rate of unemployment is found by combining those two. So if you add up all the structural and the frictional unemployment, you'll find the natural rate. So say that like 1% structural and 4% frictional exist in our economy, then our natural rate of unemployment would be 5%. We shouldn't have more than 5% unemployment, because if we do, there's a good chance it's one of the bad ones. Namely, cyclical. And that natural rate of unemployment will be sort of your anchor point for the long-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run Phillips curve in later units. We're like, that's full employment, right? Okay, well, full employment would be at that 5% in this hypothetical. So if there's more than 5% unemployment, they're in a recession. If there's less than 5% unemployment, again in that example, then you would be in an inflationary gap. So it's kind of like a reference point for you. Oh my God, did I just finish all of that in 30 minutes? Oh my God, I did. That was a lot. I know I talked very fast that entire time. I can barely process what I just did, and I don't think I have technically all of the formulas for this unit here. I think I have most of them. I don't think I have actually all of them down. But this covers you for a vast majority of it. So these are your things for this unit in terms of content. I'm going to pull up AP Classroom here in a second. I'm going to Alt-tab out so you don't see my login screen, because I have to re-log into AP Classroom, because just like you guys, AP Classroom kicks me out after 5 minutes of inactivity and asks me to log in 16 separate times before I can get back into AP Classroom. That is not just a you thing, that is also a me thing. It hates all of us equally. But I do like the website, it is pretty good. It makes my life a lot easier, I'll tell you. Alright, let me pull up the mock assessment that I made. Only a handful of choice questions and 2 FRQs here. The FRQs are really worth looking at, so if you're watching this video still, the FRQ part for sure check out, because this stuff sounds easy. When you see it on an FRQ, it can really freak you guys out. Alright, now I gotta make it big again. Make it big. There we go. Alright, first things first, GDP question. Gross domestic product has been criticized as a measure of well-being because it fails to take into account which of the following. Okay. Sorry, headphones off because my head is I'm starting to get sweaty around the ears because these are very good headphones, but I'm an adult man. So, saying GDP has been criticized. Okay. So it's not perfect. I know that. It's a number. Numbers aren't ever perfect. As a measure of well-being. Okay, so it doesn't tell me how well each person is doing. Just true. It just tells me how well the economy as a whole is doing. Because it fails to take into account which is the following. So what I can do here is I can eliminate some stuff based on what it does take into account. It does take into account services, so that's not the answer. It does take into account government services, because it wouldn't care if it's government or consumers. It doesn't take into account intermediate goods. It doesn't take into account financial transactions or used items. And it definitely doesn't tell me anything about the distribution of income. It tells me how much income total the country has. Does not tell me if like there's just one psychopath on the top of a gigantic pyramid in like Nebraska that has 22 of our $23 trillion GDP, and he's just created the world's largest pyramid in the middle of Nebraska. Like, don't know. For reference, what I'm talking about, you can look up the Bass Pro Shop in Memphis, Tennessee, which is literally a pyramid. It's hilarious. Okay. So, which of these matters when it comes to well-being? All right, so it says as a measure of well-being, how well each person is doing. Well, it doesn't tell me this, and if I knew how income was being distributed, I could probably have a pretty good gauge of well-being. So this sounds good. Apologies, my laundry just finished. This wouldn't tell me anything about people's well-being, and the financial transactions maybe only because it would tell me like more total income, but it still doesn't help me figure out anything about per person, right? Because well-being, I got to know how well each person is doing, not how well in total we are doing. I mentioned this in class when you look at GDP worldwide. China's number 2, which you're like, no duh, they produce a bunch. It's like, yeah, they have a ton more people though. So are they as efficient in production, or are those people getting as large a chunk of that GDP as we are with ours? No. Not just because our GDP is higher, but because there's so many more people there. So the answer for this is distribution of income. GDP doesn't tell me that, and if it did, it would tell me more about people's well-being. That's why things like GDP per capita are good. All right, second thing. If unemployed workers become discouraged and give up trying to find work, what would happen to unemployment rate and the number of people employed? Okay, so they were unemployed, they are now discouraged. They didn't have a job, and now they've given up looking. Well, that wouldn't change the amount of people employed, right? Because they're not looking and they didn't have a job in the first place. So I'm down to D and E already. If they stop looking for a job, they are no longer unemployed either, right? They are out of the labor force. Which means if the unemployment rate is number of unemployed people divided by the labor force, I just said there's less unemployed people. Unemployment rate goes down. This is the danger of the discouraged worker thing. Of when you stop looking for work, when you give up on looking for work and you no longer count as unemployed, the metric fails to account for you. Unemployment rate as a metric only tracks people who are unemployed. So if you stop counting as unemployed, it could mislead people into thinking that our unemployment rate is in a good spot. Of like, oh my god, our unemployment rate, like 2 years ago is a good example. Our unemployment rate's like 3%, that's so good. It's like, oh, wait a minute, we could have 80 million people who have given up looking for work because since they don't count as unemployed, we could have a crazy low unemployment rate. But that's terrible. That would be really bad because those people just straight up don't count. It's like a math doesn't help us understand it thing. So that one is D. 3, increase in labor force participation rate will cause what? Okay, so more people are trying to work. Don't know if they're successful or not, but they are more people that are trying to work. So there's fewer people that are not in the labor force, right? So there's fewer discouraged workers. Good. Increased investment, decreased savings. It could cause that. I don't know how it would cause this. Right? It could theoretically cause increased investment because more workers making money could be making more money, but that wouldn't decrease savings. And same thing here, where like savings, I don't know why those would change. Investment theoretically could go up, not down, if there's more people trying to work. So these two, I don't know why one of those would be right, then would be wrong. Have no effect on unemployment. No, it would for sure affect unemployment because if more people are trying to work and there's the same amount of jobs available, there's more unemployed people. And that's why we get down to one of these two. Is it easier or harder to deal with? Well, now we've got a lot more unemployed people, so it's going to be really hard for us to deal with it. Because if they're trying to work, and again, this doesn't say more jobs pop up. It doesn't say there's more people who can, more places that can hire them. There's just more people trying, more people applying. That's going to make it really hard to reduce the unemployment rate. So E. Makes it real difficult. 4. Math question. Okay, I see a bunch of numbers. I see 3 million structural, 4 million cyclical, 2 million frictional, 91 million employed, 150 in the working age population. I got some stuff based on natural rate of unemployment, labor force participation rate, discouraged workers, a bunch of stuff like that. Things I can already eliminate. I have no freaking idea how many people are discouraged. Right. I have all of this, which tells me that there is a total of 100 million people that are either employed or unemployed, which means there's 50 million people that are not in the labor force, because there's 150 total people, 100 of them that are working or not working. So I know that there's 50 million people that are like question marks. I don't know if they're discouraged or not, so I couldn't tell you if C or D are right, so I would have to eliminate both of those. 95 million in the labor force. I just said that's not true. Because labor force is all the employed and unemployed people. Well, there's more than 95 between those numbers, so it ain't that either. So I'm looking between these two. Either my natural rate of unemployment is 5%, or my labor force participation rate is 91%. You could try and answer either of those. Let's go with the second one first. Labor force participation rate is unemployed plus employed over working age population. Again, that would be 100 over 150 times 100. 100 over 150 is 2/3, so 67%. So it ain't B. The answer is A, and I can prove that it's A. If unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed, the labor force here is 100. How many people in the labor force are the good type of unemployed? 3 and 2, so 5 out of it. That'd be 5%. Remember, you combine the two good types. Now, it's not 5% because 3 plus 2 million. It's that because this is 3 and 2% of the 100 million. They probably wouldn't make the math harder than that on you because no calculator, but be aware. Answer is A. Hard one. Which of the following is an example of how the consumer price index exhibits bias in its estimates of changes in the cost of living? Basically, what's wrong with CPI? A. Energy prices have a higher impact on inflation than other input costs do. Don't know how CPI would know that. B. New products are always overrepresented in the CPI. No, in fact, there's not a lot of new products there because they try to keep the products the same so they can check the prices year to year. So they're underrepresented. C. CPI assigns greater weight to measures of welfare than it does to economic activity. For sure doesn't even take into account welfare. D. Product improvements are not always fully reflected in the calculation of the CPI. Very much possible. Because you look at things like, okay, the average price of a car today versus the average price of a car 10 years from now. There's a good chance that like every car is effectively like a Tesla equivalent 10 years from now and would be significantly more expensive because of them being like electric or whatever, right? CPI wouldn't know that. They would just be tracking a car, a mid-sized sedan. They check the average cost, like the most common mid-sized sedan in 2020. Most common mid-sized sedan in 2030 is the Tesla super sedan, which looks like an 8-year-old drew it, like their stupid Cybertruck, but just costs more than your average sedan does because it's a Tesla. Okay, cool. Well, CPI wouldn't be able to figure that part out. It would just tell me that the prices went up, so it would be misled. So D's possible. Then E, the CPI adjusts for the substitution of less expensive goods by consumers. It certainly does not. How would it do that? It just checks the price changes, guys. It doesn't check for substitution effect. So things like B and E, it's actually the opposites that are true of CPI, where new products are not strongly represented in CPI, and it doesn't adjust for substitution bias. C and A are, there's no way for CPI to track A, and C is not accurate. D is accurate. Okay, 6. I mentioned this one specifically, so we can hit this one real fast. Who benefits from unanticipated inflation? Borrowers do. Savers get hurt by it because their interest rate gets eaten into on their savings account. That's not good. Lenders get hurt because the interest rate gets eaten into on their loans. And remember, as a lender, you would want as much interest accruing as possible on a loan because you make money off of that. As a borrower, you would love to have the interest rate get eaten into by inflation because that means you're paying less in interest. So borrower benefits, lenders and savers do not. 7. Oh boy, it's a math question. I don't know if you can see that very well. So we got real GDP in year 1 and nominal GDP in year 1. Okay? We got year 1's real is 100, its nominal is 70. Year 2, the real and nominal are both 120. That tells me something important. I'm going to tell you right now. That tells me that year 2 is my base year. If my nominal and real are the same, that is the base year. Because that means I'm comparing everything to this spot. So my nominal and real are going to be locked into play. Then year 3, I've got my real is 130 and my nominal is 150. Okay, so my nominal went up by a bit more than my real did there. Okay, I know the base year is not year 1 or year 3. I just explained that to you, so it's not A or B. C, the economy is producing higher quality goods and services in year 2 and 3 than in year 1. I have no idea about that. This didn't tell me anything about quality of goods. It just tells me prices and quantities, so it ain't C. D says they are experiencing inflation during years 2 and 3. Well, nominal GDP went up by more than real GDP did, which would mean yes, there is inflation. If they went up by the same amount, that would mean that it was just the quantities that went up by that amount. But since they went up by more, there was some price bit tacked on. So like there's 20 billion of like real, like actual growth between year 1 and year 2, but there was 50 billion of nominal growth because there was a bunch of inflation-based stuff. And ditto here, it went up by 10 billion, went up by 30 billion. So there's 10 billion of actual, real, like legit growth. There was 20 billion of like extra sprinkling on from prices. So there is inflation in years 2 and 3. There's not deflation 1, 2, and 3. That would be that the GDPs would be going. The real GDP would be going down if there was deflation. So it's D on that one. Okay, 2 FRQs. How are we doing on time? 20 minutes for these 2 FRQs should be perfect. Okay, I got a bunch of freaking numbers in this table. I picked this one on purpose. My kids hated seeing this one because there's so many freaking numbers. I'm going to grab my whiteboard because I like to do these on the whiteboard. All right. Calculate, do math, whatever. Calculate the nominal GDP in 2018. It tells me the deflator is 160 here. That's good. I'm going to need that later. So 2 ways to do nominal GDP. Mention those at the very top on my little Linmu thing here. We could do CIGXN or WRINTP. I'm going to do CIGXN. You could also do this other one on this question. It would work out just fine. So C, consumer spending, 1,000. Okay, 1,000. I, investment spending, 300. You do have to know what the acronym is, what the abbreviations are for. G, government spending, 400. And XN, net exports, negative 100. So I got 1,000 plus 400 plus 300 minus 100. That would be 1,600. So my answer for A is, and I'll grab the pen out again. I always forget to get this freaking pen out. Literally can't stop me from forgetting to get the pen out so I can write answers on the screen. Big ol' idiot. Oh, the headphones are so cold now, which is great. So this would be 1,600. Okay. B, explain why the, I can move my camera a little bit, make this easier to read. There we go. Explain why the income approach for calculating GDP yields the same value as the expenditures approach. I mentioned this as a brief way to explain it earlier, so that every dollar spent is a dollar earned. That is not like a very fancy explanation. So let's see what College Board specifically wants us to write on this one. Scrolling. Part B. Yeah, you could, referencing the circular flow model would work just fine. I think if you said every dollar spent is every dollar earned, since the amount of dollars spent has to equal total income because they couldn't spend it if they didn't make it. And it's a fancier way of saying it. This is like the shortest way they would have allowed it, is pretty much what this is telling me. So according to the circular flow model, total spending equals total income. What goes in must come out. What goes out must come in. That's the basic logic behind that one. I wanted to see what they had as the scoring guidelines on this question, because I'm like, how would they want them to phrase it? Circular flow model? Sure. Explain one difference between the CPI and GDP deflator. Well, they're both price indexes. They both are used to track inflation, and they're used pretty much interchangeably to check for inflation. So what's the difference? What they track. GDP deflator measures the price changes of everything counted in GDP. That is, as I mentioned, includes consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, net exports. Includes all that stuff. CPI is the consumer price index, meaning it's tracking price changes that just the consumers are dealing with. So it's just taking into account how much people are dealing with, not how much the government or businesses or foreign consumers are dealing with. So what's the difference? What it tracks. GDP deflator tracks everything measured in GDP, whereas CPI only tracks the market basket, which is spending done by consumers. If you mentioned that CPI measures a market basket, whereas GDP deflator measures all things produced by via GDP, that would work too. Okay, D, using the GDP deflator, calculate the real GDP for 2018. I mentioned this. Real equals nominal divided by the deflator. We had that the nominal was 1,600 here, and wouldn't you know, the GDP deflator is 160. That's on purpose, because if you got 1,600, you better be like, wait, if I have to divide this is going to be a real weird answer. It's like, unless the thing you're dividing it by is 160. Because if it's 1,600 divided by 160 times 100, because that's always at the end of these, we just get 10 times 100, which is 1,000. Here's my work. 1600 divided by 160, that is just 10, because you just times 160 by 10 to get there. And that gets me 1,000. My real GDP is $1,000. Bing, bang, boom. Easiest thing of my life. Gotta love that one. E. I friggin' love E on this question. I used this question in class because of E. Assume wheat farmers in country X sold their entire crop of wheat to domestic wheat millers, who then sold it to domestic bakeries. Okay, so there's wheat being sold to the millers of the wheat, who then sell it to the bakeries. Okay, so farmers, millers, bakers. Got it. If the value of the wheat farmer's sale is 10 million, the value of the wheat miller's sale is 25, and the bakery's sale is 65, how much is their GDP changing as a result of this transaction? So, why this is tricky for my students, why this catches people. You have an instinct to add all three of those numbers together. Because you're like, well, GDP includes stuff produced on our borders, and that wheat was made in our borders, so all of it? No. GDP is the total dollar value of all final goods and services sold within our borders. Final goods. The wheat as a resource and then being milled is not the final product here. The final product is the bakery sale. So GDP goes up by 65 million as a result. Because it would only count the final sale of the bakery, because since that is the final actual product. Like if we're talking about a car being manufactured, we don't count like the chassis being built over here, which then goes to Ford, where they add on a paint job, and then they send it from the painters to the dealership, and then the dealer sells it. We don't add up all of those numbers together. We would just use the dealership. That final step, that final sale price is all we care about. It's the final good. Okay, last one. Last thing for this one. This was from last year. Last year's remote test had one of like 80 versions of this question. One of like 80 versions of this question. There is a part of this, part B, which has nothing to do with this unit at all, and part D, which is over a thing that I've only just explained in my second semester class. So if B confuses you second semester kiddos, we haven't covered it yet. First semester kids, B, we didn't hit this super hard, so there's a good chance you'll have forgotten this entire thing. So we got calculate each for year 2. Okay, so I'm looking at year 2. I got some numbers in the table. Population's 5, population's 10. There's 2 different countries that have terrible names. I got my GDP deflators and my nominal GDPs. Okay. I need the real GDP. Real equals nominal divided by deflator. Easy peasy. So for this one, times 100. So real for year 2 for Ishgandar would be 375 over 125 times 100. 375 over 125 is 3, because 125, 250, 375. So that's 3 times 100. So my real GDP there should just be 300. Oh, per capita. Sorry, I missed that. Per capita, so I divide by 5. Because per capita just means per person, so I just divide by 5. That's one of the formulas I forgot on the previous page. Per capita just means divide by population. That's not really another formula. That's just vocab. For non-Bernina, I'm doing same thing. Year 2, nominal over deflator, 440 over 110. That's just 4. 4 times 100 is 400 divided by 10, because that's their population. Right? Yes. 400 divided by 10. Because per capita, there isn't a multiply by 100 or anything. It's just how much they're producing per person. So I got 60. I got 4. Okay, if Ishgandar and non-Burmia have the same velocity of money in year 2, which economy must have a higher money supply in year 2? Okay, so, oh boy, all right. So this is a formula that's technically not a Unit 2 formula. It's technically like a Unit 3 or 4 formula, but I'm going to show it to you now because I might as well, because this doesn't show up in FRQs very often. It's the velocity of money, where it's the money supply times the velocity of money equals the price level times the real output. Basically, what you should know here is that the money supply times the velocity of money equals the nominal GDP. Because if I take your real GDP and multiply by the price level, that'll undo the inflation adjustment and get you back to nominal. So it's telling me they have the same velocity of money in year 2. Which one would have the higher money supply? Well, if this is the same between the both, the one that would have the higher money supply is whichever one has the higher nominal GDP. So that would be non-Burmia. But let me explain that formula real quick. So velocity of money is how quickly people spend money in the economy, basically. Like how many transactions occur per month or week or day. The more times you spend the money, the more spending that will occur. It's telling me that they have the exact same velocity of money. So if they're spending money at the exact same rate as each other, how would one have a higher GDP than the other? Well, that would be because they have a larger amount of money in existence. If they've got more money going around, total, like their money supply is larger, then them spending it at the exact same rate as the other country would lead to a higher GDP. Weird, they basically never asked about this in any, like, I think I've seen this in like 2 FRQs out of like 400 I've looked at prior to last year, and then they gave people like 30 different versions of this question that all asked this, and I was just like, oh, sweet God. All right, calculate just the following in year 2. Inflation rate. Well, cool, I've got GDP deflators, so that's easy. It's year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100. But for both of them, that's really easy. It's just 25% and 10%. Remember, this is the whole appeal of the deflator, is that I get to use this 100 thing. Because if I do, year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100, the year 2 deflator is 125. The year 1 deflator is 100. So if you're looking at what I'm doing here, I'm doing this. 125 is my year 2 GDP deflator. 100 is my year 1 GDP deflator. 100 is my year 1 GDP deflator. Times 100. Cancel that. 25%. I do the exact same thing on this side with the 110 and the 100. 10%. My life is done. That is the easiest thing I've done in my entire life. And then D, based on your answer to part C, if the nominal interest rate is the exact same in year 2, which economy experienced the higher real interest rate in year 2? And explain. Mention this. This is actually the Fisher equation, where nominal equals real plus interest, but I'm just going to write it as real equals nominal minus inflation. So the nominal interest rate was the same for both, so let's just call it 5%. Who has the higher real interest rate? Well, 5 minus 25 is less than 5 minus 10, so the higher real interest rate is non-Burmia. Non-Burmia has the higher real interest rate because they had a lower inflation rate. Technically speaking, that's the mathematical explanation for it. Let's see if they have a different way of explaining it on this question. I actually do wonder how they want me to explain D, because there's a math explanation that's very easy. Oh, there's also part E. Jesus Christ. Okay. Higher real interest rate had lower inflation, and the real is equal to the nominal minus the inflation rate. So if you just did that math and said the thing I said did not work, that's all I looked for. Cool. E. Oh, I didn't see E. Okay. Assume that in year 1, non-Burmia is operating inside its PPC, and that the PPC remains unchanged from year 2 to year 1. As a result of the change in real GDP from year 1 to year 2, which there is a significant change. We're using non-Burmia's numbers here. Okay, non-Burmia's. I want to double check theirs and see exactly what they're talking about. Okay, so their real GDP would have been 300, and then it was 400. Okay. Does their economy move closer or further to its PPC? Explain using numbers for real GDP and state what will happen to cyclical unemployment in the short run. Okay. So they were in a recession at the start when their real GDP was 300. Okay. Now, after a year, their real GDP went up to 400. Remember, we calculated the real GDP per capita here. Ended up being 400 divided by 10. Or, wait. Yeah. Well, that should have been 40, not 4. My bad. Yeah, sorry, that should have been 4. That should have been 40 for that. My fault. If you caught that and were like flaming me in the chat, feel free. No, that was correct. I messed that up. So it went from 300 to 400 in terms of real GDP. It means they really did produce more, like actually produce more. They did a better job in the second year. So it's saying they were here on the PPC, and it says their PPC remained unchanged. What they mean by that is that the line didn't move, which is actually helpful. The PPC remained unchanged going from year 1 to year 2. Not saying that they're still here, just saying that the line is still there. As a result of the change from real GDP from year 1 to year 2, does their economy move closer to or further away from its PPC? Basically, would this dot get closer to the line or further away from it? What they're really asking is, are they doing better or worse? And their real GDP went up. They're doing better. So it should be getting closer. It could be on the line. If I'm asked to explain using numbers for real GDP, I would say because its real GDP went from 300 to 400 billion, they should be moving closer to their PPC because they should be getting lower amounts of cyclical unemployment due to the higher level of production. As businesses are making more money, they can hire more employees, thus reducing the cyclical unemployment. Otherwise, the phrase would be like, by closing the recessionary gap or by shrinking the recessionary gap, that should be allowing for less cyclical unemployment because the recession is getting less and less severe. Let's see if I completely botched that entire thing. We can check and see if I'm an idiot or not. Let's find out. Moves closer. It's real one from 300 to 400, and cyclical unemployment will decrease. It's almost like I'm good at this class. Wow, that's crazy. All right. That is it. That was a lot, but that's technically not everything for Unit 2, so be very careful and make sure that you review the next couple of things, because I didn't cover these in this video, only because I have a 15-minute video that covers one completely, and the other one is like a 5-minute chunk in another video, so feel free to watch them. It's the circular flow model and the business cycle. Those two things are also a part of Unit 2, so make sure that you review those. Those are not as complicated as they might seem. Feel free to look up videos from things like Khan Academy if you need it for the circular flow model. It sounds big brainy, but it's not as hard as it seems. Additionally, ACDC Economics here on YouTube has a bunch of shorter videos that if you need a quick synopsis or quick review of a thing, feel free to use that. Mine are not meant to be quick. They're meant to be fairly deliberate. But if you need something fairly fast and easy, use the ACDC Economics videos. Those are much shorter and easier to digest. So feel free to use those. But as always, thank you all for watching. I wish you all the absolute best of luck going forward. If you have any questions about the stuff I did in this video, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll respond to them best I can.